We're now joined via Zoom by Deon Oberholzer, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Gestalt Group. He assists organizations with strategic BEE solutions. He's also served as the Deputy Chairperson of the Association of BEE Professionals. Deon, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Good evening, Peter, and thank you for having me.
All right, so you're somebody who's been immersed in this for some time and has a good understanding of the goings-on. Let's get, first of all, an overall view from you of what you've seen over time and why the BEE Commission has got to a point where they've said not enough has happened in terms of transformation and meaningful BEE transformation and deals.
Peter, yes, thank you. I think the section that you had specifically talks about BEE ownership, whether it's broad base or narrow base, and it talks about the issues on the ownership side. And absolutely, the Commissioner is correct that there are a lot of models that have been implemented that are not conducive to proper transformation. We also have other elements of the codes in terms of whether skills development are meaningful, whether the socioeconomic development are meaningful, whether supply chain transformation is happening. So it's a multifaceted a problem that we are dealing with, and each one of those elements has its own challenges, opportunities, and fronting schemes are unfortunately quite common in each of these as people grapple with the rules. I mean, we see if we look, for example, in apparel in tax legislation, you tend to find that the way to deal with that is to make the legislation more clear and more defined and more properly set out. The downside that we have with the BEE legislation is that it's not always as clearly defined and properly set out as, for example, tax laws or other laws are. And that leaves a lot of room for interpretation or deviation or different approaches. And certainly those barnhouse doors needs to be closed so that people know what does it mean in terms of voting rights, what does it mean in terms of net equity value, what does it mean? And those things are quite important. And certainly there's quite a lot of things that government has done over the past 2-3 decades since the ANC government came into power and even before, that we look at this and we are disappointed. Why do we still have such vast unemployment? Why do we still have such low representation of women in top executive positions? And we have to ask ourselves, are the rules vague? Can we make them more clear? Can we make it easier for people to comply? And those are all the issues we have to deal with. So, I mean, for example, business often says to me, we don't mind complying, just make it clear so that we know what we have to comply with. And I think those are sometimes, that is sometimes a priority. That clarity is actually almost our biggest enemy.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk nitty-gritty just now, but I just want to get a sense of people's attitudes. People come and consult with you, much like I'd come and get a tax consultant, and when I talk to a tax consultant, I want him to give me the least pain. I want him to find a solution where I pay the least. Is it the same attitude with a lot of people that have to be giving up equity to say, let's do it in a way that makes it less painful for me, so that the spirit isn't about empowering, but rather I have to give up something?
The point is the way in which the legislation is brought to the table, it does require you to give something up in order to give somebody else an opportunity to participate. And that's always something. There's a compromise, there's a give and take. And if you take a third generation family business that now is suddenly being told you need to open up ownership to somebody, never mind black, white or green, outside of your family, that creates a lot of resistance. And we tend to find that with owner-managed companies, they have 3 rules. They basically say, don't tell me how to run my business, don't take too much money in terms of the value you produce, doesn't matter who you are in my organization, and don't blackmail me and allow me not to move on with my life. And when they look at ownership, that's where some of these issues actually come to the fore. And they would want, obviously, compliance. So let me just take a step back from the point. You asked me over time. So I've been involved in in BEE for the last 15, 16 years. And in the initial phases, it was educational. And there was a lot of resistance with the concept of transformation because it was new and it was felt that it was a threat, et cetera, et cetera. We found that across the spectrum. Where we are now, it's more of a business as usual approach. What do I have to do? What is the most cost benefit I can get from it? If I need to spend money on something, can I do it in the most effective way? So there's a lot of a more sort of like day-by-day approach about BEE. People are not we have very few arguments about why we should do it. We have a lot of discussion about how we can go about doing it in a more effective way. And we tend to find that if you do it for the right reasons, it also benefits the right people. And we mostly deal with people that want to do it because they wouldn't ask us how to avoid doing it. Then they would rather go and look for a scheme or a scam with somebody else. So our experience at the moment is people are saying, I don't mind doing it, but can I do it in a cost-effective, business-beneficial way that's not going to put my company at risk and that'll help me move forward with what I'd like to do and whomever we are in the greater picture. And it's not all bad from that point of view. But unfortunately, there are some, there's always somebody that detracts from the outcome that you want.
All right, so in theory, I mean, it should be a simple equation. You get shares, those shares give you voting rights, which could include things like seats on the board, dividends, that kind of thing. But if you don't have money to buy these shares, this is where things start getting complicated, isn't it? And I just wonder how, over time, have we found vehicles for you to say, I've got shares, but they're encumbered in some way. And I guess they have to be if you are going to get something for nothing initially, that for a period of time, there must be something that you have to give up as well.
The calculations are quite intricate and it's unfortunately not simple. If you stand back from it, there are simple elements to it. A spade is a spade, and you can call it by any other name. I mean, there's so many metaphors we could use. But the point is the golden rule. If you have the gold, you make the rules. And I think that it comes into this to play. The power balance is difficult, and there's also greed and opportunity that comes into play. So we see lots of newspaper articles about people agreeing to schemes that may not be on paper, that may on paper look okay, but it's not. And it's often an opportunistic response to say, I haven't got anything to provide financially, so I'll take what I can. And that skews the power balance in the negotiations. So if the company says, I have to do this, I'll bring you in as a shareholder, I'll do whatever the rules tell me. Our defense should be that those rules must be absolutely crystal clear, because then the industry that monitor the application of the rules, the whole verification industry under the guidance of SANAS with oversight from the BE Commissioner, we don't have confusion. The rules are simple. You have to follow the rules. And it shouldn't be that difficult to apply. But your point that you make is if you don't have the money to put on the table up front, then it sometimes becomes a great temptation for business to try and structure the rules to protect themselves. And it often happens that it skews to the side of the stronger, which is always the case in negotiations, or often the case in negotiations. So there are a lot of models that allows us to get around that. Vendor financing is probably one of the most popular ones that we prefer to use, where there's a mutuality about how we finance this opportunity, and then it's paid off from dividends received, et cetera, et cetera. But it has to be real. I mean, as the Commissioner said, you have to be able to pay it off in a period of time. Otherwise, you'll never get any benefit from it. So how do we structure it that there is some benefit, but some liability and obligation, and some opportunity, and balance it out so that everybody wins? I think that's what everybody's trying to achieve. The fight is about how we go about doing it.
One of the things that I've seen over time is you say to someone, here are the shares, you'll pay it back from your share of the profits. And then what they do is they run up the expenses so that your profits are not huge, and therefore it takes you forever to pay back. How do you start to work your way around things like that? Well,
we found ways of trying to deal with that practically on the small scale by putting caps at the end of it. So we would look at the company forecast, we will include it in a transaction and say that we do this transaction based on this forecast. And we often say to business owners, so you've given me a business forecast, we facilitated an empowerment transaction. That empowerment transaction showed on your forecast with the dividend policy you have that it's realistic that it'll be paid off in a 6-year period. So that's good. Let's add another 2 years and say if it's not paid off in an 8-year period, we have to come back to the drawing board and say that there was something wrong in your calculation. We have to reduce the price, we have to forgive some of the debt, or do something else to normalize this. Fortunately, we have the situation in the codes that we have the factor of cumulative net equity that sort of brings a bit of reality to that. That says if the net equity over a period of time doesn't meet those targets, then they tend to lose points on the scorecard. Now, it might not be that important that they lose or don't lose the points, but it's a way of monitoring this going forward. So are there transactions that is sort of underwater all the time? Yeah. Yes. There are quite a few. Are there that have been structured incorrectly because the seller, the business entrepreneur, would overvalue his company, and then if it doesn't materialize in dividends, he just says, oh, well, that's what we call business risk. Welcome to the real world. And we have to weed those things out by making the rules clear that you can't have an impossible time frame. But I mean, it's a different story buying into a consulting firm versus buying into a mine. Mine, your return on investment might only be after 30, 40 years, but in a consultancy, you would expect some return maybe from the profits in the first year. So it's all different challenges in different circumstances.
All right. The other side of this, of course, and you touched on it a little bit at the beginning, is fronting, where you have people who may be people of perceived influence and who cannot possibly physically be genuinely involved in the number of businesses that they're attached to, but having their names on letterheads and forms brings them income just on that basis. Do you see a lot of that still? Because that, I know, was a big problem for a long time.
We see that. We don't, as we see, we're not a verification agency anymore. Yeah. We just provide on the strategic side of it. So we don't audit many companies, and most of the companies that we work with, we figured out and properly implemented their ownership right up front. So it's not that we have a high traffic coming across our table, but there are schemes and scams out in the market, and you can just follow the money. Just follow the money. It says, so if dividends are paid, are there a monthly fee? Is there, so what happens at the initial? How did we set the price? How is it paid off? What happens if it's not being paid off? And you follow the money, follow the process through. And the chances are that you would be able to, and I hate using the words, but rent a BEE partner, pay somebody an amount of money, which he wouldn't have got otherwise, and ask him to facilitate or be available in a specific way. And people look at the opportunity and say, it's an opportunity I wouldn't have had, so yeah, I'll do it. Is it right? No. Does it happen? Yes. How do we stop it? It's a difficult question. One way is proper policing through the verification process. In order to do that, we have to make the rules clear. So we can manifestly define the difference between an acceptable structure and an unacceptable structure. You can't have a verification agency trying to carve out the reality in vague terms. So, for example, the BEE codes in its current form have been around for almost 10 years. We are still finishing the verification manual that tells you how you're supposed to implement and verify those set of codes. Still not done. Would have been done, I mean, I was involved in drafting some pieces of that like 8 years ago. Still not done. Now, is that white business's fault? No, it's a collective problem that we are not actually doing the things we're supposed to do. Where's the BEE regulator? Why has he not yet been appointed? Why is there not conversation to weed out all the opportunities of fronting and the challenges so that the rules are clear? I mean, if you get reviewed by a verification agency, they are trying to do the right thing based on the rules they have, but the rules are vague. So by making the rules clear, they can say to you, you're not allowed to do that because in terms of item 3.52, that's not allowed. Or I need to measure this according to this calculation. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of we have to do it because we want to, as opposed to because we we follow the rules as they are written. It's almost like saying if everybody knows they have to pay their taxes and arrive below the speed limit, so let's take the speed limit away, everybody will behave. No, you have to be very specific. How fast am I allowed to drive in every stretch of road? And it's not that you make the rules impossible to apply. You just refine them as they go along. We see that with the Companies Act, we see that with tax law, we see that all over legislation in South Africa. We look at the new business rescue practice that have come up. They are refining the legislation in the courts by saying you're not allowed to do that, you are allowed to do that. And that refines, by virtue of precedent, what's acceptable behavior. BEE doesn't have those elements in to refine the interpretation and define them clearly. And I think it's a gap in the structure.
All right, Deon, we could talk about this for quite a while for sure, but we're going to have to leave it there for tonight. But I think the overarching message is that the authorities can improve things just by getting clarity on the rules, and I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Your insights greatly appreciated.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, Deon Oberholzer there, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Gestalt Group, assisting organizations with strategic BEE solutions. And he's also served as Deputy Chairperson of the Association of BEE